Welcome back to the Blackletter Podcast. We set out to create an entertaining and exciting podcast about law and business. Blackletter, the name, comes from the Gothic typeset. Over time, Blackletter became the only font that English law books were printed in. It made it harder for kind of the common person to understand what the English law books said. Blackletter came to represent something that was law, that was set in stone, that was sort of old and a well-settled fundamental principle of law. We're here to demystify Blackletter law. We're here to demystify things that happen in business and law and where those two meet. And I hope you have fun listening. Welcome back to another episode of the Blackletter Podcast. With me again, I have Jennifer Morris and Toby Musser from M&S Group. Jennifer, of course, is with DBL, one of my law partners. We are diving into what CMMC 2.0 is and its requirements for government contractors. So listen closely, because this is not just fun and interesting stuff, but it's useful stuff too. So let's jump in. So I'll start with on the legal and policy side, Jennifer. What is CMMC 2.0 at a base level? What does that mean?
Well, CMMC is a new requirement that is being levied by the Department of Defense. And I say new because I mean CMMC 2.0. CMMC 1.0 has been in place and was sporadically put into some Defense Department contracts. But now it's getting a much more robust initiative. And from a legal perspective, this isn't unusual. It seems as if it's just one more step in the federal government's attempt to protect U.S. citizens and companies from the cyber risks that are out there. I mean, we've seen the SEC, the FTC, and this is DOD's version of what are the increased cybersecurity protections that we can require companies that do business with us to have in order to do our business and protect our information.
So Toby, from your perspective, what does that mean from an audit and compliance perspective, from a technical and practical aspect? What do you do? I understand, Jennifer, you come in and talk about the policies and the legal requirements that are in the statute, that are in the DFARS or the FARs. Toby, what's your role in that and all of that? What's M&S Group do?
Sure. So originally M&S Group in 2017 was on the implementation side, right? The government said you have to do these things, these 320 things that you have to do in NIST 171. And it was included in all the contracts, and we were helping people do them. After a bit, the government said, people are attesting to the fact that they're doing them, and maybe not intentionally lying, but for whatever reason, the things aren't getting done. We're going to make a new rule. It's going to be called CMMC to authorize assessments, or audits might be how you and I use the language, but the government's language is assessments. And so we signed up very early on in that program. And so we are assessors under the Cyber AB, which is authorized by the Department of Defense, to come in and do that assessment and look at artifacts, or maybe you would think of it as evidence, for the 320 things you need to do to comply with your contract.
So when you're an assessor, Toby, does the government hire you, or does a company have to go to one of the certified assessors to get assessed? How does that assessment process work?
It's a great question. So only authorized assessors are allowed to offer these assessments, and you have to hire them out of your own budget on your own time. And our authorization comes through a direct DBCAC high assessment we get, just as if a contractor would get a DBCAC high assessment. And then we're authorized for 3 years to deliver that same type of assessment to defense contractors. And so you have to, the way the timing of the rule goes, you may want to develop a relationship with the C3PO or 2 now to make sure you have a spot in line in the next 24 months.
So this is and Jen, maybe you can answer this. I would go to my lawyer, Jen, and say, well, when is the time to talk to Toby? Because if I want him as my assessor, I can't use him as my implementer. So, who do I go to for my implementation before I find my assessor? And do you find those people at the same time? Do you need your lawyer involved at the same time? How does that all work? Say I'm new. I mean, there are a lot of folks new to government contracting, especially SDVOSBs and 8As and people who are small, who are going to look at this as, wait, another thing I have to spend money on, and another report I have to do, and another box to check. So how do you deal with that? What's your answer to a business that's like, what do I do?
Well, I think there's lots of ways, Tom. I mean, obviously, the contractors in general are frustrated with the government putting in so many compliance requirements at their own cost, as Toby mentioned. But I think from a legal perspective, what we as a firm can offer is that when a company comes in to, let's say, do an initial audit, they may hire somebody like Toby's company to say, how bad are we? Let me figure out what the risks are. How many, dings do we have, so to speak? And they could do that under the attorney-client privilege, which can protect some of that information. Now, when Toby comes in to do an official C3PAO assessment for the Department of Defense, those results are shared with the Department of Defense and aren't able to be protected under the privilege. So if I were going to recommend to a company is that, yes, you need to have an assessment. If you're a DoD contractor, get an assessment early, first under the privilege, to figure out what you can do for remediation before you get an official C3PAO assessment.
So this raises a question then. So it seems to me to get privilege, my understanding of attorney-client privilege is the lawyers, we've got to hire you to hire Toby. Otherwise, privilege doesn't apply. So that's my first question. Is that correct in this circumstance? Second question is, if Toby is or M&S Group is my risk assessor on the commercial side that I've hired through you a privilege, they cannot also be my government assessor. Is that correct? Or can they also be my government assessor? How does that work?
The current rule language does not permit me to work or to do a government assessment for anybody I've done work for in the last 36 months.
Gotcha.
And very similar to legal practices, even our employees that we've hired, if they've moved from other firms, we have to do a conflict check and make sure that that employee has not performed any services for a company that they're going to be involved in assessing in the last 36 months.
That's really interesting. Okay, gotcha.
And so when I've worked with Toby's team in the past, I know that they have solid relationships with other companies who can do the initial assessment. And there's many companies out there, managed service providers and other sort of assessors that can do those assessments under the privilege. And then they can connect with Toby to get on the calendar. Because I think you heard Toby say there's only 50 assessors. And I think we all know how many DoD contractors there are. So Toby's team is going to be ramping out 2 to 3 months at least. I defer to him, but it's going to be a busy, busy time.
Tens of thousands. So CMMC, as it stands at 1.0, I guess is what it is, has multiple levels of certification or requirements, something like that.
So let me jump in. They threw 1.0 away. We're solidly in 2.0.
We're in 2.0 now. Okay.
We're in 2.0.
So I assume 2.0 has different levels of certification. So my two questions, what is the difference between 1.0 and 2.0? And what are the different levels of certification and who needs them?
So 1.0 had 5 levels and had what are called maturity practices, where we assessed your performance over a period of time.
Okay.
2.0 simplified that down to 3 levels and removed the maturity practices so that we're just doing the things in NIST 800-171. No extra items from other standards or other requirements. So it's a simplification to lower cost. Level 1 is federal contract information. And that is basically anything related to delivery of the service. I don't want to read you the legal definitions, like 5 long sentences, but I think the important thing is level 2 is the sensitive information that the government wants protected that is not secret, but if enough of it gets put together, concatenated, it can create a risk for the government and for all of us as citizens in the United States.
Okay. So FOUO type stuff or?
So CUI replaces the FOUO designation that is no longer authorized for use anywhere. No one should have FOUO.
I got out of the military like 15 years ago. So
yeah, no, it's great. It's great that you know that. We do recommend, of course, following the Department of Defense's the DoD CIO on LinkedIn. It's a great way to know kind of where things are going. But FOUO is replaced by CUI. It's basically the same stuff.
Tell me about the Joint Surveillance Voluntary Assessment Program. What is that? And what's the value of that?
That's a great question.
I don't know if that's something that is all M&S, or is that a legal thing too? Like, what is that?
Yeah, so that's when a contractor either gets a notice that they're getting a surprise audit from DBCAC, that's the government's assessment organization,
Okay.
or if they opt to submit to DBCAC and say, hey, I'd like an assessment, that at this time, before the rules finalized, which seems like it might be October, in this in-between time, you can request that a C3PO like M&S Group come in along with DBCAC and do the assessment in parallel. And at the end of that assessment, if you have a perfect score of 110, that will then convert into a CMMC level 2 status. There's some lack of clarity about how long that will last. Is it 3 years from the date of the conversion? Is it 3 years from the rule? It looks like the DoD is going to fall on the side of 3 years from the time you finish your DBCAC assessment and get that final score. But it allows contractors a scoring benefit. The government has published that the score shall be considered in scoring a proposal, and that means you can get some extra points by doing that.
Okay, so in any response to an RFP, this is going to be part of what the TEB or whatever it is, whoever's technically evaluating the proposal is going to add this into the point score. It's kind of like a factor like past performance or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Is that about right?
It is.
It's a great way for contractors who are prepared for CMMC to get those extra points. And on the flip side, it can be informative, but contractors that really aren't sure how prepared they are, or perhaps already know that they're not, may want to take remediation efforts before they bring in DIB to do a voluntary assessment.
So, Toby, can you tell us in rough terms, and I know everybody hates to answer the question, but what are the costs for implementing CMMC 2.0 or an audit or these joint program? Well, how much does it cost to do this? And I know there's some legal costs and those will vary, but what's your technical side?
Okay, so Tom, what we're seeing in the market are rates between $225 an hour to $300 an hour for assessors. And the government tells us what we have to do. So if somebody's going to generate a proposal based on the requirements, on the low end, you're looking at 180 hours. And on the high end, you're looking at 300 hours. So in English, I just said maybe $40,000 to $70,000 as a range, just based on if somebody's charging hourly for the team and doing all of the things in the assessment practices that are laid out for us. Now, the final assessment guide's not been published. So when that is, we'll be able to tighten the numbers up. And of course, you have the soft cost impact. Your team has to interact with us during that time. That's about what we're seeing in the market right now for level of effort.
And just to rewind to what we talked about earlier, if you're at level 1, you generally don't need to do this. The costs are for level 2 and above. Is that?
Absolutely. Great point. If you're level 1, you're doing a self-assessment. Now, you might want to talk to Jennifer about whether you want to take some of that risk and have a consultant help you. But you don't have to do that according to the rule.
Gotcha. And Jennifer, you'd be a good person to talk to about how to handle self-assessment and self-assessment process.
Absolutely, because there's a lot of legal risk with self-assessment. We've seen that's sort of why 2.0 was created, right? 1.0 required self-assessment and it wasn't going well. So DOJ has been implementing and prosecuting people under the False Claim Act for inaccurate certifications. So self-assessment does have some potential legal risks we want to get ahead of.
Yeah, those are big legal risks. Awesome. And what types of contractors in particular, in what industries? I'm assuming IT, anybody in the IT services space, but what other types of government contractors and what agencies should be looking at CMMC 2.0 or the joint voluntary assessment or any of this?
If you're under the DoD, even if you just mow the lawn, you are required to go through either a level 1 or level 2 assessment, and some highly sensitive contracts may be required to go through a level 3.
Okay, so if you mow the lawn at the DoD, how are you, Toby, going to do a data audit security of his lawnmower?
Yeah, so it's a great question. It's probable that they would just be at level 1. It's federal contract information. So CMMC assesses physical security, operational security, and cybersecurity. At a level 1, somebody can self-attest. They do not need to hire a consultant to come in and do it. The
I see.
DoD's published a wonderful level 1 assessment guide. It gives you all the questions that will be asked, and it gives you suggested forms of answers. So you can go through, read that booklet, and it's likely you can do most of it yourself.
Perfect. Okay, that's great to know. And do you have a link to that on your website?
Absolutely, and we can make that available to you as well. The DoD website is the source of truth on all of this. If you hear Tom say something, Jennifer, if you hear me say something and it conflicts with the DoD website wins. So we'll make sure you have that link.
So we will put that link in the video attached to this podcast and the post attached to this podcast for listeners out there. If you want to go to the DoD website and see what the actual CMMC 2.0 rules are. And we'll also have M&S's website links up there and any other data they want to share. So I think we've got at least I feel our listeners have a good grasp of who needs to worry about this. Everyone at DoD or working for DoD. Got it. And kind of what they should think about and do. And it sounds to me like the best advice, do we need to do this joint voluntary program? Because the timing to me, even from what you said, Toby, is a little bit like, well, do we wait to closer to October so that our certification lasts longer from the date, if it's from the date that we finish the assessment? I mean, it feels like you've got to play a little bit of a timing game. So what I would recommend to listeners is talk to Jen and Toby about this rather than guessing. So what I'd like to do is come back in our next segment, Toby, and ask you about challenges with implementation and audit. And Jennifer, same thing. When you guys work together on projects like this, what challenges have you run across? And then let's also talk about maybe it's a data breach thing. And I don't know where that falls in what you guys do, but let's cut to the next segment on that. We'll leave our podcast listening guests on a cliffhanger. So thank you guys. Thanks everybody in the audience for listening to this episode of the Blackletter Podcast. Download us on iHeartRadio, Spotify, iTunes, wherever you get your stuff. And we'll see our beautiful faces on YouTube. We'll see you next time here in a few minutes for you guys. That's all for today's episode of Blackletter. Thanks again for listening. Join us next time when we talk about more Blackletter issues in creative ways. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode, and check out our website at blackletterstudios.com.